Have you ever stared into a photograph and felt that it was watching you back? In the dim, dusty basement of the Boston Historical Society, an archivist named Laura Bennett discovered an 1897 studio portrait of a mother and her young daughter. At first glance, it appeared serene, a perfect image of Victorian prosperity. But then she looked closer, and something in their eyes froze her blood. The mother's gaze seemed filled with panic, the child's with silent terror, a fear that had been captured and preserved for more than a century. Laura's curiosity would lead her down a path through forgotten newspapers, crumbling asylum ledgers, and letters hidden away in long-forgotten attics. She would uncover the story of Elizabeth and Clara Ashworth, a mother and daughter, torn apart by secret lies and the ruthless power of one man in 1890s Boston. Behind the polished smiles of that photograph lay a hidden truth, one that no one dared speak aloud at the time. Over the next minutes, we will follow Laura as she peels back the layers of history, revealing a tale of fear, courage, and survival that has waited 127 years to be told. At first glance, this 1897 studio portrait of a mother and daughter looks peaceful, almost tender. But linger for just a moment longer and their eyes begin to tell a different story. The basement of the Boston Historical Society always smelled of old paper and forgotten time. Laura Bennett had worked there for 3 quiet years, cataloging donations that arrived in dusty crates and fragile boxes, each one a tiny doorway to another century. On a cold February morning in 2024, as the wind whispered against the old basement windows, she opened a box labeled simply Estate Sale Beacon Hill. Missing her photographs, beneath layers of tissue paper yellowed and fragile, Laura discovered dozens of photographs from the late 19th century. Most were ordinary, stern gentlemen with heavy mustaches, children in their Sunday best families posing stiffly on front porches. She had seen thousands like them. But then, her hand stopped. The photo she held was different, a studio portrait, perfectly composed, the kind of image Boston's wealthy families once commissioned. In the corner, the mark read, Whitmore and Sons, Studio, Boston, 1897. 2 figures occupied the frame. A woman in her early 30s, dressed in a dark, high-collared gown with ornate buttons, and a little girl, perhaps 7 or 8, wearing a white lace dress ribbons in her carefully curled hair. They sat together in a velvet chair, the daughter on her mother's lap, their posture immaculate, their hands delicately arranged. Behind them, the painted backdrop of columns and draped curtains completed the illusion of refinement. Everything about the photograph whispered wealth, respectability, serenity, until Laura looked closer. The mother and daughter were smiling, or rather, their mouths were shaped into something that resembled smiles, the kind expected in photographs of that era. But their eyes betrayed them. The mother's gaze was wide, unnaturally fixed, not serene, but straining, like someone holding back panic beneath a fragile mask. And the little girl, Laura, felt a shiver crawl up her spine. The little girl's eyes were filled with silent terror. Her tiny hands clutched her mother's arm with desperate force, the knuckles pale against dark fabric. Laura had examined thousands of Victorian portraits. She knew the stiffness, the discomfort, the long exposure times. But this was something else. This was not formality. It was real frozen and preserved across more than a century. She turned the photograph over. Faded pencil marks read, Elizabeth and Clara March, 1897. May God forgive us. Laura's pulse quickened. She took out her phone, capturing the faces, the hands, the smallest folds of clothing. Then, with trembling fingers, she opened her laptop and began searching the Society's digital archives. Elizabeth and Clara Boston, 1897. The investigation had begun. All that day, Laura combed through directories, journals, and census lists, but the names were too common. Without a last name, the search was like chasing shadows. She turned the photo under the magnifying glass again, scanning every inch for clues. The studio mark Whitmore and Sons was her best lead. Hours later, buried in the Society's records, she found it. The Whitmore studio had operated on Tremont Street from 1889 to 1902, serving Boston's upper class. The details of the mother's dress confirmed it. The leg of mutton sleeves, the elaborate trim, all expensive, fashionable, unmistakably 1897. So they were wealthy, respected, perhaps even admired. Then why did they look so afraid? And that haunting inscription? May God forgive us. What sin could be captured so perfectly in a single photograph? Laura didn't know it yet. But she had just uncovered a story the city had tried to forget, one that had slept quietly beneath the dust for more than 120 years. The little girl's white dress spoke volumes. In the 1890s, white was a luxury, impractical, delicate, demanding servants to wash and press it. These were not middle-class Bostonians. No, Elizabeth and her daughter belonged to the city's upper echelons, the kind who lived behind tall windows and polished brass doorknobs on Beacon Hill, or in the grand houses of Back Bay. Laura leaned back in her chair, thoughtful. If they were wealthy, there had to be records. Birth announcements, society mentions, property deeds, traces of their world still lingering in print. She opened the digitized archives of the Boston Globe and began to search the editions from 1897, focusing on the social columns that chronicled the elegant details of upper-class life charity events. Dinner parties, arrivals, and departures. Hours passed as she scrolled through the grainy scans, eyes aching from the faded ink. Then, in the March 15th edition, a small notice half hidden on page 7 made her sit bolt upright. Mrs. Elizabeth Ashworth and daughter Clara have departed the city for an extended rest. Mrs. Ashworth's health has been delicate of late, and the family seeks the restorative benefits of country air. Ashworth. Finally, a last name. Laura's fingers flew across the keyboard, searching every possible mention. Slowly, a portrait of privilege emerged. William Ashworth, banker, philanthropist. A man whose name graced the ledgers and dinner invitations of Boston's elite. His address, Mount Vernon Street, right in the heart of Beacon Hill. He appeared often in records board meetings, charitable functions, gentlemen's clubs, but after that, March 1897 notice, Elizabeth and Clara vanished. No further mentions, no teas, no garden parties, no charity luncheons. William continued to appear in print, but always alone. A quiet unease rippled through Laura. She took out her notepad and began to write what she knew. The portrait had been taken in March 1897, likely just before the extended rest. Elizabeth's health had been described as delicate, a word Victorians used when they wished not to say too much, illness, melancholy, or something darker. And then both mother and daughter disappeared. Laura's eyes flicked to the photograph again, to those eyes frozen in fear, and to the words written in fading pencil, "May God forgive us." What needed forgiving, and by whom? She checked the clock, nearly 6. The Historical Society would soon close, but she knew sleep would not come unless she learned more. Laura gathered her notes, sealed the portrait carefully in its archival sleeve, and made a decision. Tomorrow she would go to the Massachusetts State Archives. If tragedy had touched Elizabeth and Clara Ashworth, there would be traces, death certificates, asylum records, court proceedings. Somewhere between ink and paper, the truth must still be waiting. The next morning, the sky hung grey over Dorchester. As Laura arrived at the archives, a modern, sterile building so different from the dusty basement where she usually worked. She carried her notebook, the photograph, and a handwritten list of records to search vital records, asylum admissions, court documents from 1897 to 1900. At the front desk sat a middle-aged archivist named Robert. He adjusted his glasses as he read her request. "The Ashworth family from Beacon Hill," he murmured. "That's a name I haven't heard in years. What's your angle?" Laura slid the photograph toward him. "I'm trying to find out what happened to this woman and her daughter. They disappeared from public records in March 1897. Robert studied the photo for a long moment. His face changed, softened, darkened as he noticed the dread in their eyes. "Victorian Boston," he said quietly, had its ways of making inconvenient women disappear. He gave her a thin smile. "Let me see what I can pull." An hour later, Laura sat surrounded by cardboard boxes, each filled with brittle paper and faint ghosts of ink. She started with death certificates. Her heart tightened as she ran her finger down the columns of names, March through December 1897. No Elizabeth Ashworth. No Clara Ashworth. Relief washed over her, followed by frustration. They hadn't died, at least not in Massachusetts that year, which meant they had gone somewhere else. She turned next to asylum records. In the late 19th century, Massachusetts had several institutions where the wealthy could quietly hide away the inconvenient, the mentally ill, the scandalous, or the shamed. McLean Hospital in Belmont, the Boston Lunatic Hospital, and others whose names time had mostly erased. Laura took a slow breath. The lights above her hummed softly. The pages whispered as she turned them. Somewhere in those endless lines of names and numbers, she could almost feel it, a presence waiting, something that wanted to be found. And deep down, she already knew. Whatever she uncovered next might change how she looked at that photograph forever. Taunton State Hospital. Even the name carried a certain weight, like the echo of a locked door far down a hallway. The admission records were fragile, many pages torn or stained with time. But Laura worked through them patiently, one by one. And then in the McLean Hospital ledger for April 1897, she found it. Elizabeth Ashworth, age 32. Admitted April 12, 1897. Committed by husband William Ashworth. Diagnosis: hysteria and melancholia. Patient displays agitation and makes unfounded accusations against family members. Laura's hands trembled as she lifted her phone to capture the entry. Hysteria. the word that silenced generations of women, the convenient label that made every pain, every protest, every truth seem like madness. And those unfounded accusations, what had Elizabeth tried to tell them? What had she seen inside her own home that no one wanted to hear? She searched for any mention of Elizabeth's release transfer or death. But after June 1897, the name simply vanished. No discharge, no date, no cause. Elizabeth Ashworth had entered McLean Hospital and disappeared from the record. But what about Clara? Laura's stomach tightened as she turned to the juvenile admissions. If William Ashworth had locked his wife away, what had he done with their 7-year-old daughter? The answer came from the Boston Female Asylum, an institution meant for orphaned and dependent children. Clara Ashworth, age 7. Admitted March 20th, 1897. Father unable to care for child due to mother's illness. Child is quiet and compliant but suffers from nightmares. March 20th, just days after the photograph was taken and weeks before Elizabeth's confinement. William had wasted no time. He had separated them almost immediately. Laura sat still, piecing it together. Something had happened in that grand Beacon Hill house in early March 1897. Elizabeth, perhaps desperate, had taken Clara to the Whitmore & Son studio to create a record, not a keepsake, but a warning, a testament. The photograph had not been a family portrait. It had been evidence. Elizabeth had known what was coming. She had known she was about to lose everything: her daughter, her home, her freedom. So she left behind the only thing she could, a silent testimony, preserved in silver and paper. Laura felt the weight of it pressing on her chest. She needed more. She needed to know how William Ashworth had managed to erase his wife and daughter from existence so completely, and whether Clara had ever escaped the shadow of her father's power. The next 2 days passed in a blur of paper and dust at the Suffolk County Registry of Deeds. Laura traced every legal trail, every signature William had left behind. The story that emerged was one of control of a man who valued power above truth. William had inherited his father's banking firm, Ashworth & Company, in 1893, along with the grand Mount Vernon mansion. His clients were among Boston's wealthiest families. But in the early months of 1897, something had shifted. Laura found it buried in ledgers, quiet, withdrawals, large accounts closing. Cross-referencing with newspaper archives, she uncovered a small note in the Boston Herald from February 1897. Several prominent families have elected to transfer their banking relationships following concerns about management practices at Ashworth & Company. Mr. William Ashworth declined to comment. Concerns. Such a gentle word. But in Victorian Boston, polite language often hid ugly truths, scandal theft, or something even darker. Then came the court records. In June 1897, barely 2 months after Elizabeth's confinement, 3 former clients filed a civil suit against William Ashworth, accusing him of misappropriation of funds. The case was quietly settled out of court. The records sealed, the story buried. Laura leaned back, heart pounding. It all fit now. William had been stealing from his clients. Elizabeth had found out. And when she threatened to expose him, when she made those so-called unfounded accusations, he used the law itself to silence her. In 1897, a husband's authority was absolute. He could commit his wife to an asylum with nothing more than a signature. He controlled her money, her property, even her children. And society would nod in agreement, believing she was the fragile one, the hysterical one. Laura's anger simmered not loud, but deep, like a flame smothered under glass. Elizabeth had lived in a world that stripped her of every weapon, except one, that photograph. Her only voice left, but there were still unanswered questions. What had happened after June 1897? Had Elizabeth died at McLean Hospital, forgotten, nameless? And Clara, had she remained in the orphanage? Or had William reclaimed her once his secrets were safe? Laura turned back to the asylum files requesting the patient death ledgers and transfer logs. The archivist handed her a new stack of brittle pages, the ink fading to ghosts. As she began to turn them, the quiet hum of the archive seemed to fade away. In that stillness, Laura could almost feel the weight of two gazes watching her, a mother and a child waiting for her to finish what time had tried to erase. Finally, Laura reached the last letter in the file dated November 2nd, 1897. I have not received any reply to my last 3 letters Sarah Cunningham had written. I went to Mr. Ashworth's home on Mount Vernon Street, but the servants informed me he is traveling. I fear for Clara. I beg you as a Christian woman to at least allow me to see my niece. I cannot rest until I know she is safe. There were no further responses, no record of a visit, no transfer, no adoption papers. After November 1897, Clara's name vanished from the asylum ledgers as if she had never existed. Laura sat motionless for a long moment, the quiet hum of the archive surrounding her. Her mind buzzed with unanswered questions. Had William retrieved Clara? Had Sarah been silenced? Or had something darker happened? Something the asylum had chosen to hide? She turned back to her growing stack of notes, scanning the timelines she'd mapped out. March 1897 photograph taken. March 20th, Clara sent to the orphanage. April 12th, Elizabeth committed. July 15th, transferred to Taunton State Hospital. November last, no mention of Clara. Laura exhaled slowly. The pattern was unmistakable. Each step, separation, isolation, disappearance, had been carefully orchestrated. Someone had made sure the Ashworth women were erased one by one. She glanced at the small photograph lying beside her notebook. Elizabeth's hollow eyes seemed to stare back through the decades, pleading for someone to listen. Laura whispered, almost to herself, "Don't worry, Elizabeth. I'm not stopping until I find her." Tomorrow, she decided she would drive to Taunton. The old hospital had been closed for decades, its records scattered, its halls rumored to be haunted by those who had suffered within. But if Elizabeth's story had an ending, tragic or otherwise, it was buried there, and Laura intended to dig it up. November 8th, 1897. I have made a terrible decision. Mr. Peaton says our legal options are exhausted. William's influence reaches further than I imagined. The courts, the newspapers, even the ministers. He has convinced them all that Elizabeth is unwell, that I am hysterical, that we are women, overcome by emotion and delusion. I cannot fight him with the law, but I cannot abandon them either. There must be another way. The next entries grew increasingly fragmented. Short bursts of thought scrawled between ink blots and trembling lines. November 10th. I have written again to Taunton. I will go there myself if I must. If they refuse me entry, I will find someone who can help from within. November 14th. A nurse named Harper has replied discreetly. She says Elizabeth is alive, though very weak. She promises to deliver my letter to her if I pay for the risk. I would give all I have. November 18th. No reply yet. Every night I dream of Clara crying behind iron bars. Then came the final entry in the diary. Dated November 21st, 1897, written in hurried strokes that cut through the paper. I go to Taunton tomorrow. If they will not let me see Elizabeth, I will find another way in. There were no more pages after that. The diary ended abruptly. Laura sat back in stunned silence. Rain drummed softly against the tall library windows, the sound almost like distant footsteps. She went to Taunton, she whispered, and she never came back. Marcus nodded slowly. If she vanished after November 1897, the hospital records might show something: an unregistered visitor, an incident report, even an unidentified patient. Taunton kept ledgers for everything, even if they were incomplete. Laura's pulse quickened. Then that's where we go next. 2 days later, they arrived in Taunton, the grey sky hanging low over the remnants of the old asylum complex. The massive red brick buildings stood silent behind a chain-link fence, their windows shattered roofs sagging under decades of neglect. A cold wind carried the faint smell of rain and decay. They met the site's caretaker, a retired state employee, who now oversaw the remaining archive materials. He led them to a small climate-controlled annex where what was left of the hospital's records had been stored. Inside, among the dust-coated boxes, Laura found a ledger marked Visitors and Incidents, 1897-1899. She opened it carefully, her fingers trembling. There, under the date, November 22nd, 1897, a single line had been written in faded ink. Unauthorized female visitor detained on grounds claimed to be Miss Cunningham. Escorted from premises. Later unaccounted for. Laura felt the breath leave her body. Marcus leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. Unaccounted for? You don't think? Laura closed the ledger softly. I think Sarah Cunningham went into Taunton that day. And something happened that was never meant to be found. She turned to the caretaker. Do you have any patient intake records from that week? Any unidentified women admitted around November 1897? The old man frowned, thinking. Maybe. Some of the intake logs were misfiled. They're in the sub-basement. Laura met Marcus's eyes, a mix of dread and determination. Then that's where we start. Laura leaned closer to the screen. James Whitfield? She murmured softly. The name barely a whisper. Do we know anything about him? Marcus scrolled through the record. Not much, he said. Age 32 at the time of marriage. Occupation listed as clerk for the Boston and Maine Railroad. Residence, Somerville. No mention of his family. He paused, frowning. But here's the strange part. The marriage took place at home, not in a church. Ceremony performed by a private minister. Laura frowned. Unusual for the time, unless she wanted it quiet. Marcus nodded. Exactly. It feels like she wanted to disappear. Laura sat back, eyes distant. After everything she'd been through, who could blame her? She stared at the photograph again, the image that had started it all. Elizabeth and little Clara frozen in silver, both wearing that same look of quiet dread. Maybe Clara had finally found her way out, but deep inside, Laura doubted that freedom ever came easily. They traced Clara's name through the years that followed. City directories placed her in Somerville until 1916, then in Cambridge by 1919. A new address appeared under Mrs. C. Whitfield, but then nothing. No further listings, no census entries after 1920. She vanished, Marcus said quietly. Laura nodded, her voice barely audible. Just like her mother. They sat in silence for a moment, surrounded by the quiet hum of the library. The rain outside had turned into a steady rhythm, soft against the windows, like the echo of time itself. Finally, Laura whispered, "If the trail goes cold here, then maybe the answer isn't in records or ledgers. Maybe it's still in the photograph." Marcus looked puzzled. "What do you mean?" Laura turned the old portrait over in her hands. The back still bore those haunting words, "May God forgive us." "What if it wasn't written by Elizabeth?" she said slowly. "What if it was Clara?" Marcus's eyes widened. Laura continued, her voice low, deliberate. "Imagine her years later, grown alone, living with the memory of what her father did. Maybe she kept this photograph. Maybe she wrote those words herself, not as a plea, but as a confession." A chill passed between them. The image suddenly felt heavier in Laura's hands. The faces of mother and child stared back, not from the past, but from a story that had never really ended. Marcus finally broke the silence. "Do you think we'll ever know for certain?" Laura shook her head slowly. "Some stories aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to be remembered." She slipped the photograph back into its sleeve, her fingertips lingering on the worn edge. Outside, the rain deepened, washing the city in silver light, the same pale glow that might once have fallen across Beacon Hill, across a banker's mansion, across the quiet faces of a mother and daughter who had dared to tell the truth. And somewhere in the stillness of that photograph, their voices seemed to whisper, faint, defiant, unforgotten. "Save Clara, the photograph. Make someone see." Laura exhaled, closing her notebook. "I see you now," she whispered. "Both of you." Laura closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the story settle around her. She imagined Clara as a child alone in the orphanage, dreaming of her mother. And then as a young woman carrying the memory of that photograph, with her the terrified eyes of her mother and of herself forever frozen in silver. That portrait had been a warning, a testament, a silent plea. Now, decades later, it was guiding Laura to the final piece of the puzzle, Margaret Whitfield. If she were alive, she might hold the family's memory. Perhaps letters, photographs, or even stories passed down from Clara. Stories that could finally honor Elizabeth, whose life had been stolen, whose voice had been silenced. Laura and Marcus began tracing public records, voter registrations, and obituary notices. Each lead took them closer to Margaret, now elderly but hopefully still living. Hours turned into days, and finally, in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Massachusetts, they found her Margaret Whitfield, living in a modest home, surrounded by signs of a long life quietly lived. Laura hesitated on the doorstep, the photograph of Elizabeth and Clara in her bag trembling slightly. She knocked. When Margaret opened the door, her eyes were kind but cautious. Laura introduced herself gently, explaining the story she had pieced together over months of research. She showed Margaret the photograph. There was a long silence, and then Margaret took a shaky breath. I've seen this before," she said softly. "My mother kept it hidden for years. She never spoke of it. Never wanted me to know the truth. But I always wondered." Tears streamed down Laura's cheeks as Margaret led her inside. For the first time, Elizabeth's story was being told in a living room, not just in archival ledgers, not just in a photograph. Margaret shared what she knew, fragments of Clara's memories, whispered warnings, the lessons she had carried into her own life. She told of her mother's quiet strength, the secret fear, the courage to protect others even after suffering unimaginable cruelty. Laura listened, taking careful notes, but mostly she just listened. After 127 years, Elizabeth and Clara's story of fear, injustice, and resilience was finally being acknowledged. The photograph that had haunted Laura for months was no longer just an image of despair. It was proof of endurance, a bridge connecting past and present, a testament that even silenced voices could be heard again. And as Laura left Margaret's house that evening, the sun dipping low over Quincy, she held the photograph close, whispering to herself, "We see you now. We remember you. And we will never forget." The story of Elizabeth and Clara Ashworth, mother and daughter, terrified, yet brave, erased, yet enduring, had finally found its place in history. Their eyes, once frozen in fear, had finally been seen. There might still be time, Laura thought, to connect Clara with the truth about her grandmother's fate. Marcus dove into genealogy databases while Laura contacted the Massachusetts Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, hoping they might hold records of Clara's volunteer work. The organization had merged with other agencies decades ago, but they referred her to the Boston Children's Services Archive. They're tucked into a box of volunteer records from the 1930s and 40s. Laura found Clara's file. Letters she had written, advocating for children, reports from home visits, testimonies in court, all evidence of a life dedicated to protecting those who had no voice. One letter dated 1935 made Laura pause. Clara had written to a judge on behalf of a young girl whose father wished to commit her to an institution. "Your Honor, I know from personal experience how easily a child can be separated from a loving parent and labeled as troublesome or difficult when the real problem lies with those in power. I beg you to investigate this case thoroughly and listen to the child's voice, not simply accept the father's account. Children cannot defend themselves against adult authority." Laura's throat tightened. Clara had never forgotten. Her childhood had been stolen, her mother taken, and yet she spent her adult life fighting for others. But had Clara ever known the full truth about her mother, Elizabeth? Marcus found Margaret Whitfield's marriage record. She had married David Chen in 1975. Further searches revealed that Margaret was still alive, living quietly in a retirement community in Newton. Laura's hands trembled as she wrote down the address. After months of following traces across decades, she was about to bridge past and present. She called the community and was connected to Margaret Chen, whose voice was firm, clear, and curious. Laura introduced herself gently. "Mrs. Chen, I'm an archivist with the Boston Historical Society. I've been researching your family history. I've discovered information about your grandmother Clara, and your great-grandmother Elizabeth that I believe you should know." A long pause followed. Then Margaret whispered, "My grandmother never spoke about her childhood. We knew her mother had died when she was young, but nothing more." "What have you found?" "It's a long story," Laura said softly. "Difficult, but you deserve to know the truth." "May I visit you?" "Yes," Margaret said immediately. "Please come tomorrow." On a bright Saturday morning, Laura arrived at the Newton Retirement Community carrying a folder heavy with decades of sorrow and courage. Copies of documents, letters, asylum records, and the photograph that had started it all. Margaret greeted her in a sunny visiting room, joined by her son Daniel and granddaughter Emma, who had driven in from out of state. Laura spread the documents on the table and began with the photograph. The three generations leaned in, gazing at the terrified eyes of a mother and child from 1897 for the first time. "My God," Margaret whispered. She was so young and so afraid. Laura told them everything. She spoke of William Ashworth's embezzlement, Elizabeth's discovery, the deliberate separation of mother and daughter, Sarah Cunningham's desperate attempts to intervene, and Elizabeth's 11 long years in Taunton State Hospital. She described Clara's 3 years in an orphanage, her forced role as housekeeper, and finally, the adult life she built, channeling her trauma into protecting children. Daniel's voice trembled. All that, and she had no one to talk to. Emma pointed to Clara's volunteer letters. She didn't waste her life. She protected children. Laura nodded. Your grandmother was brave, and so was your great-grandmother. Elizabeth knew she would be silenced, so she created evidence. This photograph documented their fear. She hoped one day someone would see and understand. Margaret reached across the table and squeezed Laura's hand. 127 years later, someone finally saw. They talked for hours. Laura explained the legal and social forces that allowed William Ashworth to destroy his family. She described the countless women and children who had been silenced, institutionalized, separated. Before she left, Emma asked softly, "What happened to William Ashworth? Did he face justice?" Laura shook her head. No. He died wealthy, respected, buried in Mount Auburn Cemetery. The law and society protected him. But we can change the narrative now. We can remember Elizabeth and Clara for their courage, not for the injustice they endured. Margaret nodded, her voice steady. Yes, tell their story. My grandmother deserves to be remembered for her strength. My great-grandmother deserves vindication. Over the following months, Laura worked with the Chen family. She published a historical account of the Ashworth case, documenting it in the Journal of Women's History. The Boston Historical Society mounted an exhibition. Elizabeth and Clara's photograph, once a record of terror, now stood as a symbol of resilience and truth. Visitors could see not just fear in their eyes, but determination. A story preserved against time, injustice, and silence. Margaret Chen attended the opening with her children and grandchildren. She stood before the portrait of her grandmother, the frightened 7-year-old child. "We see you now," she whispered. "We remember you. We honor your courage." And in that quiet moment, the long shadows of the past lifted, leaving only acknowledgement, remembrance, and the enduring testament of mother and daughter. whose story had finally been seen.